Hello, my name is Ann McManus, and this is Government Unlocked. I'm here today with Dr. Jane Southborough, and we're going to talk to you today about the executive office. We're living in a time of rapid change. There's lots of information out there. People disagree a lot on things, and we really feel that one way for us to begin to uncover what the real meaning of our democracy is to look at the various branches of our government and to understand their role, both historically and bringing us up to date. Today we're going to focus on the executive branch, and we're going to talk about our history. It's so important today to know the history of our country if we are to be responsible citizens and to promote the growth of a country we all love. So Jane, let's talk about the executive branch and how this all came to pass. Certainly back in the day when the Constitution was being developed and before that, during the Articles of Confederation, there was lots of talk about how the government would be structured and how the leadership would be structured. What were those challenges?
Well, it's a really good place to start because the presidency has become the dominant political institution in our world today. The president is always there. Congress goes on recess. The president's always there to take the bully pulpit, as Teddy Roosevelt called it, to talk to the people or the press. So that office, the executive office as currently held by President Trump, is the dominant way people interact with government.
Was that the intention of the framers when they sat down to develop our government?
Not exactly. In fact, to come up with what do you do? Is it a person? Is it one individual as president? They actually debated at length as to whether it should be one individual person as president or a council with several members acting as president. There was a lively debate about that. And
why was there such a debate? What were the worries?
Well, the worries were that one person would have too much power. It would be like a king. And they were accustomed to an advisory council. During the colonial days, they had a governor, and then they had an advisory council, which was kind of a veto to what the governor did. And so they had experience with that. And it was mainly just concerned that all this power was going to go to one person. So as they debated, actually, James Wilson, who was a candidate or a delegate from Pennsylvania, proposed, as he moved, that there be one individual person as president. Well, the room grew silent because George Washington is sitting there presiding over the convention, and everyone assumes he's going to be the first president. So it was a little awkward to talk about the pros and cons of the power and how it might be abused if it was one person. So it really tamped down that discussion, and it moved it pretty far along. And Washington had another advantage. He didn't have a son of his own. And dynasties were something that happened in the European royalties, and there was concern about whoever the first person was going to be. Was it going to be something that a family member continued on? And so the fact that he didn't have a son was also important to some of the people who were concerned about the power of an individual.
And that was pretty much the frame of reference for folks back then. There weren't other examples of different types of government.
It really tells you just how revolutionary this was. They didn't have a model for this president that they are writing into this Constitution. And so they have to draw on their experience, and we look at their experience, there wasn't someone like this. They were really starting from scratch. We don't know a lot about actually what happened in the convention because it was secret. They met from May to September in 1787. It was a hot summer in Philadelphia, but the windows were closed, the blinds were closed. Imagine today having a constitutional convention that was secret and no leaks. I think it wouldn't be possible in today's world.
I think you're right.
But So we don't have a lot of evidence. The best evidence we have is Madison wrote a day-to-day journal. He wrote down the motions, he wrote down the roll calls, he wrote down speeches. His was a journal that went on, in real time. He wrote every day. Now, he didn't edit those, and he changed them a little. It took him years after the convention was over. He worked on these notes. So one assumes that
There might have been a few revisions.
Yeah, no, we know there were a few revisions and cleaning up a few things. But his notes on the debates of the federal Constitution of 1787 is really the classic prime source for what went on, even though we know that it was one person's and it was edited highly before it was actually published. He didn't have them publish it till after his death because he didn't want people coming after him saying, no, that's not what I said,
happened,
right? Yeah, so, but it is really the starting resource for people who are looking to study the Constitution.
But where does the Federalist Papers come in this conversation?
Well, the Federalist Papers were 85 newspaper essays that were written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay. Hamilton wrote most of them. Madison wrote several of the really important ones. And John Jay wrote fewer and mostly about foreign policy because that had been what he had done. He had been over to Europe. The Federalist Papers were they were aimed at convincing people to ratify the Constitution. They came out after the Constitution was out there, ratification was in process, and in particular New York, which was a very important state, was not keen on this. The British had a stronghold of political sympathy in New York, and so the Federalist Papers were mainly aimed at convincing and addressing some of the concerns of the New Yorkers that didn't think that this was a good idea. So again, they're interesting, they're good to read, they're quoted often by scholars and all, but you have to remember that this is, we would call it today spin, but this is really the view of the Federalists, who were the ones who were in favor of a strong national government because the Articles of Confederation hadn't worked.
But did the Federalist Papers give us a sense of what some of the arguments were that were going on during the Constitutional Convention?
Well, the Federalist Papers gave us the arguments because it gave us the rebuttals.
Right.
That's what they were, but you can infer from that they're answering those charges. For example, Alexander Hamilton is famously quoted for saying that the court would be the weakest, judiciary would be the weakest branch because the Congress had the power of the purse, controlled the money. The executive had the power of the sword to enforce the laws, but all the court would have is persuasion, judgment, and its ability to persuade that its judgment was correct. So he said that would be the weakest branch. But again, that was one of the branches that there was much concern about, obviously why he was putting that in.
And I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves, but the role of the Supreme Court seems to have really evolved in a way that maybe our framers hadn't considered.
Certainly, it doesn't meet with Hamilton's prognostication. What is happening right now, and this is to jump ahead a bit, but what you see are two really important things happening. Those of us who study the Constitution see one of the trends is Congress is disappearing. And the court is ascending. The court is becoming a more important branch in the current administration than Congress. And there's obviously, we can talk a lot about why that is so, and why Congress has given over its powers to the executive branch, and why the court has said that's a good thing when he exercises them, even though they're not really in the Constitution his to exercise. So this is one of the things that in the current situation we have to be aware of, think about, study, look at what was intended, look at what's going on, and see whether that was the intention, whether that is true to the Constitution.
Well, it certainly seems that the framers did not intend for the Supreme Court to replace Congress.
Right.
But when Congress becomes ineffectual, which unfortunately because of the divisiveness we're seeing right now,
Right.
That's the case, they're filling in the void.
Yes, and when you look at the structure of the Constitution, I've said this before, there are first 3 articles, they actually outline the 3 branches. Article 1 is the legislature, and there was a reason for that to be the first article. The legislature was supposed to be the most important branch, even if they're equals. That was the one that was closest to the people. They stand for election every 2 years. They represent constituents, specific constituents, not just the whole country. And so it was thought that they had their ear to the ground, that they were the ones who had the most power, and the Constitution gives them the most power. It gives them the power to declare war. It gives them the power to decide how taxpayer money is being spent. But one of the things that is happening where Congress has not stood up and is where the executive is using money that Congress appropriated for some things, and the president is saying, no, I don't want to use them for that, I want to use them for this. And under the Constitution, the question is, where is that authority? And that's something that, the kind of thing that the court is looking at.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Article 2, because Article 2 talks about what the powers of the executive branch are.
Right.
And it doesn't say a lot, Jane.
Again, one of the reasons it doesn't say a lot is because George Washington was sitting there, and everyone assumed he was going to be the president, and he had such respect from everyone that they really didn't want to hash out what was going to go on and how he was going to govern, because there he was, and it was a little awkward, and they trusted that he would be fine in that position. They're kind of worried about down the road. But it is slim in that way. There's not a lot. It does designate very specific powers, like commander-in-chief of the military. Now, there's a reason for that, to have a civilian head of the military. This kind of goes to the issue, again, of their experience in Europe, where the rulers were all kings or heads of religious orders. They had control over the military. So they wanted to give this president, even though he's a civilian, this role of the president, control over the military as a way to make sure that the citizens had some influence, some power over what the military might do. No coups here, although we know there was an attempt.
Yes, we do. We do. So if the executive was basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jane, was crafted around the aura of George Washington, who all respected, who was not a verbose man,
Right.
a very serious man, but the grandfather, if you will, of our country. That put a lot of, that really crafted what that Article 2 looked like. And I would assume that it was the reason amendments were put into this is that as things changed, we could amend it so that it would meet the needs of what was going on in the country during a certain period, or a need to change something because things were different.
Right.
But George, setting the bar so high, having George Washington be the reason or the descriptor, if you will, of Article 2, doesn't really seem that practical as you look, over the long haul.
We actually wish it would have been. Washington, I don't know, I hope people are watching Ken Burns' documentaries. As he says in those documentaries, we wouldn't have the United States without George Washington. And it's interesting, he's getting a lot more interest in Washington than for a long time. If you come up in the schools, you think of him as, in a toga and kind of a plaster bust of George Washington. And you hear the Apple story, but it's hard to see him as really what he really
A man,
was.
yeah.
And because there was so little put into Article 2 about the presidency, that's the reason everything he did set a precedent. And most importantly, the fact that he did not run again after 2 terms. And until that was changed after Roosevelt, that became the model. And a lot of what he did became the model for the presidency. But you know, they didn't really know what to do with this role exactly. One of the interesting and somewhat humorous things is they didn't know, they had a huge debate over how will you address this president. This is after they decided it's going to be one individual. So how will we address it? They had debates, weeks of debates about that. Hard to believe, but they did. There were all kinds of suggestions, His Highness, His Majesty. They couldn't agree on things like just president. John Adams, who was his vice president, once the inauguration took place, thought that president didn't carry enough kind of gravitas,
Yeah.
right, and so wanted something different. Well, they couldn't agree, and so they agreed to have the Senate committee come back with a recommendation of how to address it. But in the meantime, Washington is inaugurated, so they agreed temporarily to just use the word president. Well, the committee comes back after a while, and again, the country's going, Washington's president, Adams is the vice president. So the committee comes back with a recommendation that says, His Highness, the President of the United States and the defender of our liberties.
Well, that's a mouthful.
It was, and everybody agreed it was a mouthful, and Washington didn't like it at all. So in the end, it just became president.
Why was that such a big deal?
Well, in part because, again, what they're doing, there's no model for it. And so their concern is how this new nation, this infant nation at this point, is going to be received by the other great powers in the world. They wanted to make sure that somehow the person in this position would, again, be received with the dignity and honor that the head of a nation should. But again, this was just a little infant nation. But they wanted, that was their worry primarily.
But I would assume, too, on the other side of it, you had the internal politics of no one wanted a monarchy.
Right, for sure. There were those they were struggling between these two ideas. There were those that wanted to make sure that they didn't go from George III to another king.
To another George.
Or another George. Well, we got another George, right? But again, it's interesting with those who have been involved with the No King's Day. This was very much on their mind. And again, the reason is that was the way the world was at this time. This was unprecedented. So again, they had no model. The concern about a monarchy or tyranny replacing the one they had just fought and won freedom from was there were all kinds of rumors. And one of the rumors was George III's son was going to come be the king. And again, that was the reason it was important that Washington didn't have a son. So if Washington was the first president, there wasn't going to be a line of people.
You know, it all is around the power of that office.
Yes.
And the concerns were enough power to be respected, but not too much power that we would be repeating the problem of the past, which was a monarchy.
Right. That was definitely the concern. And that's where you see the two most basic principles underlying the Constitution are the separation of branches, the separation of powers, and the idea of balancing, checks and balances, so that no one branch, even though I said that their idea was that the legislature should be the primary branch with close to the people, but the idea was that no one of the three branches would become more powerful than the other. And so there were these checks and balances. So one of the powers of the president in Article 2 is he, and I'm going to say he, we're not there to say anything else these days yet,
Yep.
he could appoint ambassadors, judges, heads of the departments in the executive, which became the cabinet, but he did so only with the advice and consent of the Senate. So here's Article 1, legislature having a say in what the president can do with respect to appointing members of the executive branch, ambassadors, judges. So that's that check. There are any number in each of the branches. If you read the 3 articles, you find that there are ways that each of them are restrained by one of the other branches in some way. For example, the judiciary. One might think today, how can the judiciary be restrained? It seems to be very aggressive these days. Well, Congress has the authority to change the jurisdiction of the courts. Congress, theoretically, could say, take away the jurisdiction of the courts with respect to the behavior of the president.
So,
That won't happen, but
so Congress could make legislation to limit the role of the Supreme Court?
yes, the jurisdiction that the court has, Congress has what it says in the Constitution at the end of their jurisdiction, saying, except as Congress may from time to time alter. It may use a different word than
Has
alter.
that ever happened historically, that Congress has limited the role of the Supreme Court?
Well, not exactly, but close to it. During the Civil War, Lincoln suspended the right or the writ of habeas corpus because they wanted to be able to hold the spies that they were capturing. And that was a violation of the Constitution. So for a time, though, the court's jurisdiction to look at that was suspended. After the war,
And that was done through legislation?
yes.
Okay.
After the war, the court ultimately said that the president didn't really have that power, but under extreme circumstances, as this was a civil war, they again did not exactly.
Well, can we talk about that a little bit? Because it seems like the presidency has unlimited powers in an emergency situation. But who defines what an emergency is?
Good question. Well, we could start by saying that Congress needs to be functional. If Congress is functional, things like the War Power Resolution. The War Power Resolution came about after Watergate and the whole period of Watergate and the resignation and Nixon's resignation. The War Powers Resolution was passed in 1973, and that's in the Nixon era. The fact is, even though the Constitution makes clear that only Congress has the authority to declare war, the Congress hasn't declared war since the 2 world wars. We've been through the Korean War, we've been through Iraq, Vietnam.
Yeah.
In Vietnam, they came somewhat close to it. LBJ went and got permission from Congress for the Gulf of Tonkin.
Right. Resolution.
That's really the last time that's even close to going to Congress for permission. Presidents have gone to Congress for something that's called the, let's see if I can get it right, it's basically the permission to use military force. Has an acronym that I'm not getting right, but at any rate, it's not a declaration of war. It's a limited that gives them the permission to use military force. That was used in a number of different times with Iraq, with Afghanistan, but it's not a declaration of war. And when you think about it, we haven't had one of those. And look at all of the involvements we've had. The Congress has had limited input after really Vietnam. Now, Congress did, after the Watergate era and Nixon, come up with a lot of reforms. And the War Powers Act was one of them, which really required the president, under certain circumstances, and they laid out those circumstances, to come to Congress, limited how long a military action could go on without, again, a renewal of Congress's permission. It's a really limiting document. It spells out time frames and exactly when and how the president needs Congress's permission.
But if Congress doesn't enforce that,
right,
the president...
Right. Even though the War Powers Act had a limited number of days that you could involve in this kind of military behavior, action, that wasn't followed up on, and you didn't see Congress calling in the president and asking for an explanation or anything. It just went by and by.
So does this create a situation where it's creating precedents so that in the future other presidents could use similar tactics to achieve the goals they want to?
Well, for sure, it's not a great precedent. I think that what we see with the presidency, we began with what's there in the Constitution in Article 2. But then what happens over time is the presidents, both parties, accumulate more and more power in the executive. In 1973, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a book entitled The Imperial Presidency. It became a classic, won the Pulitzer Prize, and he wrote it in large part because of what was happening in the 70s there, Nixon and Watergate. It really didn't have any real impact, I don't think, on what happened subsequently, but it gave language and a framework for historians and scholars and politicians to talk about the powers of the presidency. And if you were graphing that, there would be nothing but an upward line. There'd be a little glitch after Watergate when they did some reforms. Some of the reforms they did, for example, was the FISA courts. Mm-hmm. And that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which means that you have to get a warrant or you have to get a sign-off by a federal judge before you can just go searching for foreign spies in our midst. The FISA courts were strengthened. This is where the idea of an independent special prosecutor came up to investigate possible misconduct of the executive branch. So there were a lot of reforms there that came through after Watergate.
But those reforms were based on congressional action, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. But Congress had acted then. They had, Nixon resigned because it was clear he was about to be impeached.
Yeah, I mean, if I can reflect back to the Watergate trials, I remember being glued to the television to watch
those. I was too.
But what was really striking and very different from what we see today is there was a real sense of bipartisan approach to the trials to try and get at the truth.
Right, and concern for outcome and concern for the country. And it wasn't like right and left aisle. It was, I can see John Dean sitting there with his wife behind him. So yes, there's strong memories of that. So at that point, Congress was utilizing the tools and then subsequently utilized the reform tools that were set up. But over time, that kind of faded into background, and the presidents, both Republican and Democrats, continued to acquire more and more power under the executive branch.
Ironically, the part of our government that should have the most power is the congressional part because it represents us.
Right.
The
it has to
people.
answer to us, the soonest, every
Right.
2 years.
Right.
It doesn't sit there for 6 years. It doesn't sit there for 4 years.
But as we talk about this, it seems the most subordinate part of our government is the part of government that represents directly the people.
I would certainly agree that that's true today. And that imbalance is a serious one with respect to how the Constitution is supposed to work for the people.
So how do we fix that? Jane, you must have the answer to that one.
Oh, I wish. If I had the answer to that one, I wouldn't be sitting here, Ann. I would be advising someone who would be in a bigger position than I was.
We've got to get back to that because, again, I think this feeds the divisiveness. If people don't feel they have a voice,
Right.
They either walk away from government altogether or they become disenfranchised and want to look for other forms of government, I guess.
Right. The answer. Well, one thing is I think we need some reforms to the Supreme Court. I think that, when Roosevelt was having no luck with the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as the group who was opposing him on the court were known as, he started talking about adding members to the court. Now, there's no magic to how many people sit on the court. It doesn't say how many in the Constitution at all. And it's been various numbers, but it had been 9 for a long time at the time that he proposed that he wanted to add some members. And that came to be known as his packing plan. And he never went through with it because he didn't have to go through with it. Those who were opposing him, one of the major ones,
Got a sense of what was in the wind.
came to see the direction things were going, and that switch is known as the switch in time that saved 9, because his packing plan never went anywhere then, but he got the result he wanted. The court started being more sympathetic to the New Deal and his alphabet soup.
But just to see, how would that go? The president would recommend that to Congress, and Congress would have to vote on an increase in membership of the Supreme Court?
It would come from Congress.
Okay.
The president could obviously, since the president is who, with the consent, biased consent of the Senate, nominates people to the court. So the president would have a role in this, but it's really Congress that would have to pass a law that basically changes the term or changes the number of seats on the court. When this began to be talked about by the Democrats, the court packing analogy came up. And people heard court packing, and it seemed not a good thing. And so there wasn't really much enthusiasm at all for that. But I must say, in the last few years, I think a lot of people have come to realize that it's maybe not a bad idea to have a few more justices on the court. And for one thing, the workload has become huge. There are the circuits, there are 13 circuits, and each justice is assigned to a circuit, but we don't have 13 justices, and so several of the justices have 2 circuits. The workload is incredible. They get 7,000 to 8,000 petitions for certiorari, petitions to be reviewed by the Supreme Court. And these days, they normally just end up taking 65 cases. But they have all of that to go through, so it would be helpful to the workload and to the opportunity for more cases to be heard that perhaps should be heard. So I think there's much more support for increasing the number of justices than there was when it first started being talked about. There's also the question of term limits. The Constitution says for good behavior, they have lifetime appointments. the only way to remove them is through the impeachment process, just as it is with the president and other members of the executive department. So if with the
Well, that's one way of balancing out power as far as the Supreme Court goes. I think addressing the issues of Congress
right,
is probably a more complicated issue.
yes, I think that term limits. Arkansas tried to do term limits, and the court struck it down. But what they do now, they could do with the court. In the federal courts, they have judges who take all of the federal judges are what we call Article III judges, which means life appointments.
Okay.
But in the federal courts, below the Supreme Court, they have retirement. They have judges that take retirement that then sit in on some cases where they need an extra judge. They are still have offices. They still they still have the appointment, but they're not necessarily
A lifetime appointment.
They still have the lifetime appointment, and in doing that, you get around the Constitution's requirement that they have a lifetime appointment. They could do the same thing for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has supported that for the federal judges below them, but they haven't looked at that for themselves. But there's no reason they couldn't do it too. So I think if you did something about the term limits, if you did something about the number of judges, and you could do that through a process where as justices were no longer on the court, you could start to add someone. It wouldn't just be you would add 3 more justices all at once, but accumulate a number of additional judges on the court, justices on the court. That would be, I think, one thing that would improve. But again, it all gets back to who's nominating it, and that whole process of the nomination is very different than it used to be.
Well, it seems very politicized
Totally.
rather than on the qualifications of the individual. Has it always been that way, or have we strayed?
No, it strayed. It kind of goes back to Judge Bork, who was a nominee to the court. He had incredible judicial experience. He had written a lot, but he was very, very conservative. And basically, he was not affirmed because the Democrats voted. There were enough Democratic votes against him that he did not get confirmed. That was kind of, the glove had been laid down then for confirmation hearings to be something very different. I mean, you can think of when...
So prior to that, it ran pretty well?
Well, prior to that, you can think of Ginsburg was affirmed by the Senate like almost unanimously. Scalia was. There was a time when you looked at their qualifications. If I was a Democrat, there was a Republican president, and she's nominated someone, and the person is qualified, I don't necessarily think that she and I agree on what we would like to see the court do, but she's qualified, then I would be inclined to vote to confirm her. Now it's become what party they represent, who's nominating them, and they don't.
And how will they vote?
And how will they vote? And so now you don't get any indication. In fact, it's not that you don't get any indication. There's actually falsehood said to the Senate during these confirmation hearings. If they're asked, for instance, as they were, as I guess it was Kavanaugh that was asked about Roe v. Wade, was he going to, and he said, it's settled law. That was the answer, like, it's settled law. And the court precedent is something that supposedly doesn't just get changed every time the court changes. But of course, that wasn't what he was going to do. And so now what you have is the nominees say, I can't really answer that because it could come before the court. So you don't really, other than if they have a judicial record, you have, or if they've written a lot, you have what they've done, but you can't get them to tell you how they look at what's coming up before the court or what you're really concerned about. So now they just become a political game, theater. And so it is totally politicized.
Was there ever any consideration of letting the judiciary decide amongst themselves who the Supreme Court would be?
What a great idea. Maybe not, I'm thinking. It depends. Depends on whose ox is gored. I don't think there was ever a consideration of that. But you used to get, like a rating, a qualification by the American Bar Association.
Yeah.
That even doesn't really happen anymore for the most part. So
the fix isn't internal. The fix is still going through the process and just having some integrity around the process.
Right. And again, there's kind of a line of young lawyers who go through and who tend to clerk for one of the justices, and then they're kind of on a track to be nominated subsequently to the court. And you see a lot of that. I mean, John Roberts was the clerk for Justice Rehnquist when he was Chief Justice. And there is a famous memo that Roberts wrote for Rehnquist about that was not in favor of the Voting Rights Act. And so we saw how that ended up coming around.
It was an indication of what was to come.
It was an indication of how he viewed it, and he certainly has fulfilled that as Chief Justice. So there comes to be a kind of incestuousness about it because, they clerk, the person they clerked for then recommends them and down the line. And so you have, at the moment,
And we could do a whole show on the Voting Rights Act because the intent of the Voting Rights Act was to make it easier for people throughout our country to vote.
Right. And actually, there's a case before the court that we haven't heard the decision yet, but everyone is pretty certain we know what it's going to be, which has to do with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. And a few years ago, in Shelby v. County, the court decided that the main thrust of the Voting Rights Act was that those political units, states, cities, counties, who had a history of racial discrimination with respect to voting, that those could make no changes to voting rules, laws, even how many places you have to register, without going before the
courts. Didn't they have to go through the courts?
Yeah, they had to go. I guess they had to go to the Justice Department.
Right, and they had to approve it.
And the Justice Department had veto power over it. You had to get what they call pre-approval before you changed anything. So that would go to the U.S. Attorney, the Attorney General, the Justice Department, and they would either approve or disapprove. And that made an enormous difference in the percentage of, in the southern states, for instance, the percentage of blacks who voted. It went, in some of the states, like I believe Mississippi, they had something like, in many of the counties, less than 3% of the black population voted. After that, the pre-approval in the Voting Rights Act, that was up to like 68%. I mean, it made an enormous difference. Well, in the case that came, it was before Eric Holder, who was Attorney General under Obama, it was challenged to do away with that pre-approval. And the Supreme Court ultimately did that.
And the reason for that is they were saying the problem has been fixed.
It's solved. It worked. And Justice Ginsburg said that was like saying, putting your umbrella aside because it had worked the last time it rained. I mean, it was a disaster. As soon as that decision came down, you saw states and cities making changes that they had put before the Justice Department and had been refused. Now they could openly put in place rules and procedures that made it very difficult for black citizens in particular.
And to take a step back, this was not what the framers intended. The Congress passed the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
And now what we see is the courts are superseding
Right.
Congress.
The Congress passed it, a president signed it into law, and now the court is saying, we don't need that anymore. It was very successful. Well, they weren't just saying it was successful. They said that the data that was being used as to who fell under the pre-approval requirement was old, and it hadn't been revised. Now, the Voting Rights Act had been renewed by Congress almost with universal votes for 5 times. And the last time it was reviewed, they made it for 25 years before it would be reviewed again. And there were volumes of evidence that was put before
that it worked.
That it worked and that it was needed.
Yeah.
It was still needed. And the court said, this is old data. It needs to be, Congress can fix this. You can come up with new data that persuades that we need it and then come back and it's okay.
So basically, the Voting Rights Act is still there, but the courts have chipped away at it to the point where it's not functional.
Well, the real key to it was the pre-approval. There is still Section 2, which is the one that's before the court now, which allows for challenges to a voting procedure or a state that has that. And that's what's before them now, and it looks like they're going to do away with that, which is really the end of the Voting Rights Act. And even that's left there, if you can, it allows you to sue them, but individuals can't do that. You have to get together more people. There's lawyer fees. The reality is that doesn't happen much. The government may try, as they did in Holder, but it just doesn't happen. So they're going to do away with the Section 2 in all likelihood, and that is Calais is the name of the lead plaintiff, and it's going to be that there are procedures that are just waiting for that to go away so that they won't worry about being sued and are going to proceed. So that's one of the areas that is very concerning.
Well, it sounds like we're off balance.
We are.
We're off balance, and it seems presidential power has filled in the void. One thing I'd really like you to help me understand is the role of executive orders in all of this, because it seems certainly under the current administration we've seen a lot of executive orders. And again, as a layperson, I'm only speaking from my own personal experience. I don't remember ever hearing so much about executive orders as I am now.
Well, executive orders, the thing about executive orders is they can be overturned by the next executive. They're not like statutes. They're not like laws. So when the current president signs an executive order that, let's say, closes down USAID, the next president can rescind that order. In fact, the current president has been rescinding a number of orders that the previous President Biden had made.
Okay, let me stop you there, though. Let's use USAID as an example. How was USAID created? Through executive order?
No, through Congress.
Oh, okay, so it was put through Congress. But so you're telling me that an executive order can supersede a decision of Congress?
It's doing that, yes.
Is that what the framers had in mind?
I don't think so. It's not only that Congress created them, Congress funds them. And again, the executive doesn't have that authority, the power of the purse. It's in the legislature. So what you see currently with the administration is you see them doing away with agencies. Now, the agencies are in the executive branch. They're
Correct.
not in the legislative branch,
Right.
but legislature creates them.
Right.
So they're in the executive branch, and but Congress creates them and Congress funds them. What is happening is there is the first sentence in Article 2. We're going to go back to basics. The first sentence of Article 2 says, the President of the United States, a president shall be, all of the power, I've got it specifically somewhere here, but it basically says that the President of the United States shall be vested in all power as executive. In other words, it says that the President has all of the power of the executive branch under him.
Correct.
However, when Congress creates something like an agency, they typically have in there that, you can't dismiss the head of the agency without cause. They may have, you have to come back to Congress. They have they keep their fingers in it. That first clause is called the vesting clause. And there's something that is called the unitary executive theory. It's relatively new. It kind of came up, it started being talked about under President Reagan, and it's continued. And its most vociferous advocate for it was Vice President Cheney under George Bush. And Cheney was probably the most powerful vice president in terms of influence of policy of any that we've had to date. And under the unitary executive theory, it basically says the president has control over everyone that's in the executive department. All the agency heads, all of the people employed under them, that president has all of that power because of that vesting clause in the first sentence of Article 2. And therefore, he can do whatever he wants with the people in his department. The courts have taken that on, and they're kind of using that. It is certainly the theory behind so much of what is happening. It is the rationale behind the executive and the current administration firing people in agencies, closing down agencies, without any of Congress's involvement.
Congress has allocated the funds, created the framework for these agencies,
Right.
and basically said, "Here you go, President. We want
This agency, you can appoint with our consent,
Yeah.
Advice and consent, the head of the agency, the secretary."
Yeah. Have the courts ruled that they can take the power away from the congressional power and allow the president to dissolve an agency that Congress has put in place?
They haven't yet done it on what we call the merits. It has come up, and the court has...
Is this part of the shadow docket?
Part of the shadow docket. See, you know more than you say you know. You know a lot. The shadow docket is really the docket of emergency petitions to the court. And it was basically intended for things like staying an execution that has been set. But
Not for the elimination of agencies.
right. But under this administration, they have used the shadow docket. There must have been in Obama and Bush's two-term presidencies, like 8 or 10 emergency petitions, and most of them were relating to execution.
Mm-hmm.
This administration uses the emergency docket, which is kind of called the shadow docket, because what happens on the emergency docket, there isn't a full hearing, there isn't an open, like when you have a full court where both sides present briefs, both sides argue publicly. There's a full hearing. The court then takes time to decide.
That's on the merits.
That's on what we call the merits.
So the shadow docket is like a placeholder?
It is. That's the way it's being used.
Okay.
Because what's happening is the federal courts, many of them are holding against the current president in some of these things that are being done, such as the firing of departments personnel. They haven't yet, and so when the lower court says they're gonna, that's unconstitutional, can't do it, then the emergency petition to the shadow docket asks the court to stay that ruling until it can come up for the merits. And when the Supreme Court does stay the ruling, and it was a ruling against the president, that means that behavior can continue on until it does come to the court on its merits.
But practically speaking, if you have a job and I take your job away from you, even if it's just a placeholder thing, it's going to be hard to fix that later on.
It is.
So-
And again, the damage is being done while we wait for it to get to the Supreme Court on its merits. So in a sense, the Supreme Court is undercutting, in a way, the lower court's decisions by basically putting them on hold until it gets to the Supreme Court, and which allows this to continue on, the behavior that a lower court in some instances have found is unconstitutional. So
So these executive orders are problematic in many, because the intent of executive orders were for emergency situations such as a stay of execution, which, it's a very time-limited thing on it,
Right.
a stay of execution. Eliminating an agency
right.
is a very different kind
Right.
of thing.
Now, these aren't related to the executive orders necessarily, except as they get challenged in court, and then the lower court may say, that's unconstitutional, and then the shadow docket or the
kicks in.
emergency petitions are put before the Supreme Court, and in fact, most of those requests, the Supreme Court has granted the stay, which ends up meaning the behavior continues. For example, there is a stay on a lower court that says ICE agents cannot use racial profiling. The Supreme Court put a stay on that, which means basically the ICE agents can use racial profiling.
Until they make a determination. The
Until-
Supreme
right,
Court makes a
right.
determination,
And
which
so-
that could be.
Next year or whatever. That could be a while.
So I guess it takes us to the next thing I'd like to talk about is accountability. We've got three branches of government. How does accountability figure into this?
Well, Anne, you keep asking these tough questions. The accountability...
I'd like to think there's some light here.
Yes, right. Well, again, I guess that's because that's what I study, but it goes back to the Constitution. The Constitution has the tools there to demand accountability, but they have to be used. And with the Congress being basically non-functional, I think it had the lowest, I think the last term had the lowest production of bills or statutes of any. They were busy doing other things.
Well, honestly, I think as taxpayers, we see them not doing much of anything except fighting with one another.
Right. We see them on recess. We see them shutting down the government. But they're still getting paid.
Uh-huh.
So, and again, one of the things that was created, one of the reforms after the Nixon and Watergate era, was this idea of a special prosecutor, an independent prosecutor, independent of Congress, independent of the Justice Department, who would be responsible for investigating purported or charged misconduct by the executive. And of course, we saw what happened with that. We saw Jack
Smith, yeah.
Smith, who was appointed as a special prosecutor in connection with the case that had to do with Trump keeping the documents and taking them to Mar-a-Lago, and the Mueller investigation, and transfer of power to the current president, and this Justice Department dismissed the case. And now he's being investigated for his role in that. You've just had him they had a public hearing of the private conversation between, deposition between Jack Smith and the Senate Judiciary Committee.
I listened to it.
Yeah. And again, so accountability is kind of being turned on its head, just as the members of Congress that were on the January 6th committee, some of them are being investigated by the current Justice Department for their role in that. So accountability, as I say, at the moment is missing in action.
And I think that's, I also think a role, when I look at, what people in the community are facing, it's the kind of social media and media we're all exposed to is so polarized that it's very hard to get a sense of what's really happening and what's truth and what's not truth.
Yes, the social media and the platforms, which are so rapidly changing, and again, really with the
Artificial intelligence
coming on, the ability to produce misinformation in mass that can reach millions in seconds is a fact of our lives that the framers never would have imagined. I have trouble imagining it.
Me too.
Right, but and as a result, it has so polarized the country, and it's made it difficult for the sides to talk with each other. I always said to my class at the beginning of a class, you took one of them, that the former senior Patrick Moynihan had a quote that said, every person is entitled to his or her opinion, but not to their own set of facts. And what's happened is we are in a world in which you say, seeing with your eyes, you can believe it, but what you see with your eyes these days maybe can't be believed through AI and through manipulation of social media. And it goes out so rapidly to so many people, instantaneously. So I just can't imagine if you could do a graph of how much is out there. It's just exponentially magnifying, repeating, adding. So that's a situation that is really, I don't think we see an answer to. It's very hard. The companies that are behind this are behind it. They don't want to tamp it down. They don't want to take some responsibility for monitoring it. Some of them have made head fakes in that direction, but not really. And of course, we have the First Amendment, which says that, you can't really, and you don't really want to say somebody can't say something as long as it's not immediately leading to violence. So it's a tough question. And
what can we do? What can we do as people in the community?
Well, we can try to establish communication with people, both with people who agree with us, but be sure and talk about it, but with people who don't see it the same way. And if we can develop some civil conversations. The problem is, again, when you have two different set of facts, it can very quickly degenerate into, writing off the other person, or even worse, being angry and unpleasant and just walking away. So it makes it difficult. But I think what we have to do is we have to try to talk not just to our own bubble, our own choir. We need to find friends, maybe they're not even friends, but opportunities to talk to other people in our community and to try to understand why they see things the way they do and try to help them understand why you see them differently. But that process isn't nearly as quick as the social media is. It's way ahead of us.
It's really hard to listen, and listening's really important right now.
It is.
I do think, too, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think we're a little lazy. We see things on TV or we see things on social media, and if it goes the way I like it, I'm on board.
Right.
If it doesn't, do I take the time to spend a little time to find out what actually is the truth?
Right. Or do you take the remote and
Change the channel?
Right.
Yeah. And I also think we've gotten lazy as far as understanding our roots. I think the history of our country and what our framers did and how our democracy has evolved is worth knowing.
Absolutely. And part of what is worth knowing is recognizing that this isn't a given. I mean, we're looking at 250 years soon for the Declaration of Independence, but it was such a tenuous issue at the beginning. These men, and they were all men, who came to the Philadelphia Hall and sat there through the hot summer of 1787 and came up with this document. There was nothing that suggested, everything suggested to the contrary, that this was going to work, that this was going to make it, that these once colonies, now states who've declared their independence are going to be able to work with each other. They have been competitive with each other. And I think that it's only through recognizing that this isn't a given.
That's right.
And, in fact, if you study history, you find all of the great empires ultimately failed.
Okay.
So, and 250 years doesn't even make us a great empire, although we think otherwise, but we're young still in terms of histories of civilization. So I think if we can recognize that, it gives us a little more motivation, not just to say, oh, well, politicians are all crooked, it doesn't matter, it'll work out.
Yeah. And that's the easy way out.
It is.
To walk away from it. So I guess our advice for folks who are watching this now, if you're feeling dismayed, go to the library, get a copy of the Constitution, take a look at it.
Right.
And try and understand it. And if you don't understand it, look to find answers.
Right.
There are lots of courses out there. I know you know that. And also, I think, what you said earlier, Jane, I think makes a lot of sense. We need to listen to people we don't agree with.
Right.
And try and understand their perspective. And hopefully at the same time, they'll try and understand ours.
Right.
So shall we leave it at that, Jane, for today?
I think that's a good place.
All
Hopefully
right.
that's giving people some motivation to get out there and talk.
That's right.
But not just talk. As you said, listen. That's so important, and it's so hard to do when you're hearing things that you don't agree with.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane.
Okay.
Well, that's it for Government Unlocked for today. I hope we gave you something to think about. Thank you.